I'm Hallie Jackson with a breaking news special report. Donald Trump on trial with court just wrapping up in the last hour. Testimony today pushing us into the nitty-gritty of the alleged hush money scheme at the center of what's happening in court. But the headline, or maybe shadow, looming over Mr. Trump now, and the thing we just heard him talk about in the hallway, that warning from the judge that the former president, somebody who could maybe be the future one, could end up in a jail cell if he's not more careful about what he says. And in just the last couple of minutes, we heard Mr. Trump sounding more open to the idea, perhaps, of being behind bars than the idea of holding his tongue. Listen to this.
This judge has given me a gag order and said you'll go to jail if you violate it. And frankly, you know what? Our Constitution is much more important than jail. It's not even close. I'll do that sacrifice any day.
So that is Mr. Trump there after the judge, Judge Merchan, seemed kind of at the end of his rope, telling Mr. Trump to his face, the last thing I want to do is put you on jail. He says, you are the former president, but he says he will if necessary. That was the rare firework in a day that honestly consisted mostly of what you could call some legally necessary slogging for the prosecutors, with two new witnesses very carefully laying out the painstaking process of reimbursing Michael Cohen to the tune of $130,000 and Mr. Trump's participation in that. Remember, prosecutors say that money was allegedly paid to keep two women quiet, two women who claimed to have had affairs with Mr. Trump, affairs that Mr. Trump denies. And today, the jury got its first look at those checks in question, allegedly used to reimburse Cohen for a retainer that prosecutors say never existed. That's the reason this whole trial is happening and why the former president has pleaded not guilty to 34 counts of falsifying business records. We are now really in the business records portion of this whole thing. For the next 20 minutes right here, we're going to explain why everything you just heard matters, taking you inside all the rooms cameras couldn't be in. So if you were not glued to every note, every word coming out of court, if you had other things to do, we didn't. We got you, and this report is all you need, with our team of reporters, legal analysts, and political experts ready to break down everything you need to know in this special look inside the Trump trial. I want to start with Yasmin Vasugian, who's outside court in New York. So, Yasmin, a couple of buckets here today. Let's start with this partial gag order and the threat from the judge now, the warning from the judge that Mr. Trump faces potentially even more consequences if he keeps violating that partial gag order. Talk us through what we just heard from the former president and where this goes.
So the former president saying this judge is out to get him, that he has a gag order on him. He can't say things. He wants to be able to defend himself publicly. He's being attacked, so on and so forth. It's kind of the same things that we've been hearing from the former president in that hallway outside the courtroom over and over since this trial first got up and going. But the moment, I have to say, Hallie, as some of what you just read, between the former president, along with his attorneys, and the judge sitting on that stand and talking about the violations of these gag orders, now the former president owing an additional $1,000 in this violation of a gag order because he said 95% of the jury is Democrats, was a real moment, right? Because you read that quote there, right, where he said essentially he didn't want to have to do it. It was the last thing he wanted to do. This is the former president of the United States, possibly the next president of the United States. There are so many complications, by the way, that we don't even think about involved if, in fact, they decide to imprison a former president of the United States, Secret Service being one of them. At one point, Hallie, he goes on as well, and I want to read this quote for you if I can. It is apparent that monetary fines have not and will not suffice to deter defendant from violating this court's lawful orders. Therefore, defendant is hereby put on notice that if appropriate and warranted, future violations of its lawful orders will be punishable by incarceration. I will say it seems as if at this point, Hallie, the former president, his attorneys, they've gotten the message. And I say that because of what happened at the end of last week. At one point, Susan Necheles, one of the former president's attorneys, approaching the bench and saying he'd like to post or repost, I should say, something put out there by a legal analyst in order to defend himself. Can he do this? Judge Juan Merchan said, listen, if you feel like it's a bad idea, your instinct is probably right, don't post it. But I'm not in the business of telling you what you can and cannot post. So we'll have to wait and see whether or not the former president is going to continue to violate these gag orders or not. One other thing, Hal, right? The prosecution saying, we don't want to have to put you in jail. That'll only delay the trial. Right. They don't want the former president to have to go to jail here.
You got to wonder, too, what the former president's attorneys are telling him. We're going to get to that in just a little bit with our legal panel. But let me ask you about what I think is fair to call a bit of the legalistic slog in court today. Necessary for the prosecutors, right? We have now moved away from kind of those salacious and lurid stories involving some of these alleged sex scandals, alleged affairs that the former president denies. Now we're into like the crossing of the T's and the dotting of the I's here. Lay out that groundwork the prosecutors feel like they have to put in front of the jury right now.
It was a slog, but I have to say this, and I say it over and over again, which is it seems like the star witness of this case is the documentation. It's the paperwork. We saw all 34 counts in evidence today, invoices, checks as well, ledgers as well. We saw it all laid out, painting a picture of the $35,000 a month that was paid to Michael Cohen between these two witnesses, right? Deb Tarasoff, Jeffrey McConnell, really kind of laying out how it is they were able to pay off this money throughout the year of 2017 up to $420,000. The total payout, Hallie, split out between $130,000 that went to Keith Davidson, Stormy Daniels' attorney, $50,000 to a tech firm, $60,000 in bonuses to Michael Cohen, and the rest, by the way, paying up Michael Cohen for taxes, right? Essentially doubling that $180,000. As you said, it was a slog of a day, but integral, Hallie, to the prosecution's case today.
So let's pick that up then. Yasmin Vasugian, thank you so much, live for us in downtown Manhattan. Let's pick that up with our legal analysts, NBC's Danny Savalos and Catherine Christian, a former Manhattan assistant DA. And Catherine, to you first here, because to Yasmin's point, the prosecution does seem to feel like they have to lay this out. This is integral to the case. How do you do that without the jury's eyes glazing over? And do you think they accomplish that?
They accomplish it. And let me just talk about this slog.
Please.
Those 12 ledger entries, those 11 checks, those 11 invoices, that's the case. Those are the 34 counts of falsifying business records. So we can talk about porn stars and election fraud and Playboy models. This is a falsifying business records case. So each one of those documents that was presented today, the invoices, the checks, and the ledger entries, are the crimes in this case. And the prosecution has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump made or caused to be made a false entry in his business records of his company, and it was done with the intent of the fraud. That included an intent to commit or conceal another crime. So it's boring, it's tedious, but this was all very important testimony today. And it also, these McConney and Ms. Tarasoff, you know, the accounts payable person and the controller were very important because they went through the accounting procedures of the Trump organization. So they were very important witnesses.
Catherine, you just talked about Deborah Tarasoff. She is this employee in the accounting department for the Trump organization who got into, Danny, some of the, you know, quote unquote receipts, basically, some of the documentation here. She said that it was only the former president, it was only Donald Trump who signed any checks from this so-called DJT account. You see the quote here. Why is it important here that this was a piece of information that she delivered? Because if the defense team can prove that Donald Trump didn't know or wasn't involved in this alleged hush money scheme, you know, does it matter that that's his signature there?
It does matter. It's not conclusive proof, but it is very significant. Number one, not just that his signature is on there. The prosecution knows that a lot of businessmen, bosses, may just sign checks en masse when they're handed to them and may not pay a lot of attention. That's why you also saw testimony that, for example, anything over $10,000 had to be personally approved. Now, is it conclusive proof? No, there still is a narrow path for the defense to argue that, look, just because he was having stuff sent to him, even at the White House, and he's signing it, doesn't mean that he's negotiating or looking at the bills. In fact, I expect they might argue that, hey, if he's getting it FedEx to him and signing it at the White House, he doesn't even have an opportunity to do really anything other than just sign it with his big Sharpie and send it back. But the prosecution made a lot of headway.
If there was perhaps a star of the court proceedings today, it may have been that Sharpie, Catherine.
Yes, because I think it was Ms. Tarasoff. She recognized the signature because it was in a black Sharpie, and that's how Donald Trump did it. But Danny is right. This case is not over. It has not been proven beyond a reasonable doubt yet, because neither witness today said, in fact, one of them said that Donald Trump didn't direct him to do anything. So neither witness today placed Donald Trump at the scene of the action, so to speak. So it's very important that Michael Cohen be found credible by this jury. So the witnesses so far have corroborated what Michael Cohen has done, but it's going to have to be, you know, Michael Cohen being trusted by this jury when he says that Donald Trump told him to do it.
So court will proceed. We will see the former president back in court tomorrow. We know that there's typically no court on Wednesdays. But the shadow over all of it, right, the thing that's hanging over this is what we heard the former president talk about on his way out of court just within the last hour. And that is the violations that the judge has decided he conducted against that partial gag order that's in place here. Catherine, the judge only agreed on one new violation today. There were 9 others already. So this is another $1,000 fine, but we laid it out at the top of this special report. The judge seems at the end of his rope here with former President Trump. Is it like just gut check, right? Judge Merchan said very clearly, I don't want to put you in a jail cell. I will if I have to. Is that really what happens? There's been some discussion. Maybe he puts him in timeout, like in a holding area, you know, behind the bench or whatever. What really could happen here, honestly?
And the judge once again gave himself wiggle room. If it's necessary and appropriate under the circumstances, I will do this. And he spoke directly to defendant Trump because he doesn't want to do that because it will be a logistical nightmare. And it's interesting, and Yasmin pointed this out, Donald Trump has not been violating the gag order since last week. Yes, he's allowed to trash the judge and District Attorney Bragg and the court proceeding and that this was a witch hunt, but he's stayed away from witnesses and jurors and the court staff and the DA's staff and their families. So despite what he said about how jail there's no way in the world Donald Trump wants to go to jail. So you know, the judge will not do it unless he's forced to do it.
Is that a smirk, Danny Savalas, that I see on your face, a defense attorney? What are his attorneys saying to him?
They're saying nothing. I mean, to be candid with you, at this point, they already know the score. This is not, look, sometimes you have an incorrigible client. What are you going to do, yell at him? I mean, it doesn't work even with regular, normal clients. The biggest problem for defense attorneys in especially white-collar cases is the client. The client thinks they know how the world works and how to explain everything away, and they don't realize that doing things their way is why they're in criminal court in the first place. It's the way it's always been, the way it always will be.
Danny, before I let you go, quick timeline question. The prosecution suggested that 2 weeks from tomorrow is when they anticipate wrapping up sort of the bulk of their case here. How long do you anticipate the defense going? In other words, what does that tell us about when the jury might actually get this case?
Yeah, it will be shorter than anticipated. And to echo what Catherine said, I think the prosecution doesn't even need witnesses like Karen McDougal. They may not even need Stormy Daniels at this point. Maybe I'm being a little too minimalist here, but the defense case is almost always shorter. Look for them to call at least a few witnesses, but it will generally be shorter because we don't have the burden on the defense, so we don't have anything to prove. We can stand on that alone.
Danny Savalas, Catherine Christian, great to see you both back here again in our special coverage. Thank you. Let me bring in now David Farenthold, investigative reporter for the New York Times, who, of course, scooped the infamous Access Hollywood tape, which has been a key thread in this trial. It's good to see you here on set, David. Thanks for being here. So let me just kind of start. As somebody who knows a thing or two about the Trump org, who is quite familiar with this business and its practices, what stood out to you from today?
The thing that struck me was we've talked so much during this trial and in the past about how Trump sort of keeps a little bit of distance between himself and the things that are done on his behalf. There's always a little bit of a wink and a nod, both as a president and in the Trump organization. He would sort of put out a hint and people would go carry forth his witness.
It was like an implication, not a command.
Exactly. So there's always a little bit of distance. He also does an email, which makes it harder to trace, individual decisions back to him. But this is the one instance in which what he does, everything has to go through him, and that's money. Everything he has to sign, all the $10,000 and above transactions he has to approve. It's the one case in which sort of the sort of ethereal and hard to trace decision making that he's cultivated breaks down. He is directly involved in these decisions. I think it's what's so interesting about the case, the checks and the transactions brought up today.
There was also this piece of testimony that was revealed today that may not have made a huge splash at the moment, but that could be very consequential down the road, which is this. When a former controller of the Trump org told prosecutors that the accounting department handled the general ledger for the former president's personal account, which seems out of the ordinary.
I mean, from my reporting on Trump's charity, the accounting department of the Trump org wrote out the charity checks too. Donald Trump treated the Trump organization as basically just different pockets of his wallet. And so they would pay out money from the organization's funds. They'd pay out money from his own funds. Again, this is a time where sort of this all becomes sort of centralized to him. He's the bottleneck. He signs the checks for all this stuff. And that's why it's so important that they're sort of connecting him to these transactions.
let's look ahead here, because Danny teed us up well for this, right? The prosecution thinks maybe a couple more weeks after this, then the defense will go. Question is, who will we see before the defense takes its turn here? Will we see Stormy Daniels? I mean, we're going to almost certainly, of course, see Michael Cohen here. How important is that, do you think, to the prosecution's case? Why will that be impactful?
Cohen is important because, remember, Trump has tried to limit the number of people in these decisions with him, the number of people who are in the room who are not his blood relatives. And there's only a few in these decisions. One of them is Alan Weisselberg. He's in jail now for not testifying. Another one was Michael Cohen. The circle was not that much bigger. So Cohen is going to be there to say, I did this, and Trump told me to do this. This was all happening in his direction. We've heard a lot of other people sort of bolstering the case Michael Cohen's going to make, but only he's the one who can say, yeah, I was in there in the room. Yeah, I made these payments. This is why I did it. So I think he's going to be really important. I do think we'll see Stormy Daniels, just because not only because she's at the center of all these allegations, but also because she can say, here's what I understood about where the money was coming from. Here's what I understood about what I was supposed to do or not do as a result of getting this money and who it would help.
So is that the biggest thing that you're looking to for the rest of the week, if or when Stormy Daniels may take the stand?
Stormy Daniels, and also just how both sides handle Michael Cohen. He's obviously a very key witness here, but also a very troubled witness. And I think how both sides, build him up and try to break him down is going to be fascinating.
I bet you'll hear a thing or two about his book called Revenge from the defense.
Yes.
David Fairville, great to see you. Thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it. That brings us nicely here to the politics of it, right? Because we know that what is happening in court is a collision to what's happening on the campaign trail. Somebody who knows that, former Trump comms director Brian Lanza, Democratic strategist Amisha Cross is with us as well. Our political pros, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Brian, let me start with you here. Former President Trump, maybe under the threat of serving some time in a jail cell. How do you think that's sitting with him?
Yeah, probably not well. I mean, but, listen, he's tested boundaries his entire career. He's broken every norm we can think about, whether it's a business norm or presidential norm. So I'm not surprised he's challenging the judicial norms, and he has a strong case. I mean, voters very much feel that it feels unfair that other, witnesses in this case can sort of say negative things about President Trump, but he's restrained from responding to that. So I think, he's challenging himself. He probably hates being restrained, but it's part of the necessary evil that we're in today. Of
course, it's a partial gag order, so he can go after the judge if he wants to. Some other instances. We talk about the implications more broadly beyond just those 12 jurors in court. There's not a ton of polling out there about this, but there is some new polling out from ABC News in just the last 24 hours showing that 1 in 5 of his current supporters, so people who are with him now, you see it on screen, would either reconsider voting for him or no longer support him if he were to be convicted. Is that the sound of alarm bells over at Trump HQ or not?
No, listen, I think we've heard this for now 8 years, that this is going to be the thing that sort of scares us.
But we're in a historic criminal trial now, right?
I mean, it was a historic election in 2016. It was a historic election in 2020. Everything Donald Trump does is historic. And so you sort of can't point to the polling and saying that's going to have this impact. What we've seen historically over the years is that polling has been inaccurate when it comes to predicting what's going to happen with President Trump. And so what the election is going to be about is most likely going to be a referendum on Joe Biden. He made promises to his coalition. His coalition is clearly dissatisfied with those promises. And that's why you probably see the rise in Trump in the polls doing so well in previous cases. Now, the 1 in 5 support, I mean, I know everybody's polled that, and it's not new polling. We've seen it before.
Consistent, yeah.
It's very consistent, but it also, when you look at deeper into it and you look into focus groups, it says, it says obviously the federal felonies matters more than the state felonies. If you look at even more focus groups, nobody takes in the focus group, nobody thinks Alan Bragg is actually, abiding by the law. They think he's weaponized the law. They've literally changed the law to stretch the law to maybe charge Donald Trump with a felony. Like, these things are breaking through, and we'll see what the president does at the end of this. But he's always done a good job of sort of tailoring the message that puts him in a winnable position. And why would it change now?
You said that Donald Trump is trying to make this a referendum on Joe Biden. Joe Biden's trying to make this election a referendum on Donald Trump, Amisha.
No, absolutely. And the more that Donald Trump goes out there and tries to say that the DOJ is weaponized against him, the more that he tries to argue that January 6th wasn't a big deal, and wants to, issue pardons for the individuals who participated in that disruptive process, trying to steal the election and overturn the voting process. I think that hurts him. But unbelievably, or believably so, considering where we are in this state of affairs, I don't think that a Trump conviction would honestly move a lot of people away from his camp. Quite frankly,
because it's so baked in.
I think they're absolutely baked in. And aside from those who are already, kind of on the fence, which is a much smaller grouping at this point, most people have already decided where their camps are going to be. They're not going to be moved by a Trump conviction because they will just argue, like they've been arguing this entire time, essentially that all of these forces have been weaponized against him and that it was designed by the Biden administration. We all know that that is not factual, but Donald Trump has done a really strong job of messaging that. He's done a really strong job on the campaign trail, fundraising, anywhere he is, of basically saying that the Biden administration and the Biden campaign are utilizing this and are fighting against him.
There is a segment of the Republican electorate that is not sympathetic to that perspective from former President Trump. It is not a big segment. It is what you might call a sliver of the Republican electorate, but it's represented by people like, for example, Jeff Duncan, who is out today with an interesting endorsement of President Biden here in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I think we can show it here. He says that Mr. Trump's behavior and his legal issues have disqualified him from serving in the White House, essentially. We are hearing from the Biden campaign late today saying that they are actively reaching out to Americans like Jeff Duncan. But should they be doing more to reach some of these high-profile or higher-profile disaffected Republicans?
They should, and it's a double-edged sword here, because on the one hand, a lot of these high-profile disaffected Republicans also want to run for a higher office, and they recognize that the Trump name and brand still carries in the general Republican electorate, so they're not willing to necessarily put their name brand on an endorsement of or anything that looks like one for Joe Biden, with the exception of the folks who we already, have seen come out and, testify during the January 6th or were on the committee. Aside from those people, I think that he runs a strong risk. We even know that the governor of Georgia, who, has spoken against him claiming election fraud, specifically in that state, has not come out and supported Joe Biden, nor has he talked to the Biden campaign about anything. I think that what we're seeing is people who have ambition on the Republican side, even if they disagree with some of what Trump has done, they're not willing to put their name and their stake out there for something that might ruin their potential political futures.
Brian?
I mean, it's space politics. You have the Democrats who are going to sort of be true blue to whatever Joe Biden says or does, and you have Republicans on the red side who are going to be the same thing. I mean, that's what base politics is they're making the decision, and that's where we are. We're in tribalism. Our political system is very tribalized today, and it's tomorrow, if it wasn't Joe Biden, it would be somebody else. It'd be Kamala Harris, and they'd probably be splitting the electorate with President Trump as it is. I mean, the challenges are that everybody's already made a decision on this.
Yeah, but it's going to be the margins. I mean, you know this. It's
sure,
but
the margins don't help Joe Biden, because remember, he's the one who built this coalition in 2020 with the help of the media suppressing information that they suppressed to get this coalition across the finish line.
Take exception to that, but
the margins help on things like women's reproductive rights, but I don't necessarily think that these cases or the criminal court is something that most people are voting on, to be honest. And they are more interested in where the policy meets the road. So, whether we're talking about immigration, whether we're talking about women's reproductive rights, whether we're talking about issues related to housing and housing affordability, they're looking at those issues. And obviously, the economy tops everything every time.
Well, inflation and border security, both the two biggest issues.
As they look at those issues, they clearly have President Trump in the lead.
Some of the polling has shown, in fact, that it is a very close race. Donald Trump, in our most recent NBC News poll, has the lead within the margin of error. Brian Lanza.
We've never had that in 2016 or in 2020.
Question is, too, we don't have like 16 hours, but what happens when you expand the race to 5 ways, right? If you bring in some of these independent... We'll talk about it more. Come back. We got plenty of days for this trial to continue. Brian Lanza and Misha Cross, thank you both very much for being with us. We've got a lot of other big headlines to get to tonight. We're going to catch up on all of it when we pick up our regular programming right here on NBC News Now, right after the break. We're coming on there with breaking news in the Middle East at this critical moment. New strikes in Rafah at the same time that Israel's considering a ceasefire deal. What we're just hearing from the Israeli government literally in the last 5-10 minutes. We're live in Tel Aviv. Plus, back here at home, millions across the central U.S. getting a very rare warning tonight. The risk for super powerful tornadoes, maybe dozens of them. We're live on the ground in the path of the potential danger zone. And some breaking news NBC is learning about exclusively. An American soldier being detained in Russia. The latest on what he's accused of doing. Then Starbucks' ex-CEO on what he thinks is wrong with the coffee chain and how the leaders now should fix it. Why the company might want to listen a little bit later on in the show. Hey there, I'm Hallie, and right now it is after midnight in the Middle East. It is 12:27 in Israel at this key moment in the war between Israel and Hamas. The Israelis launching new strikes into a major city in Gaza. At the same time, it's considering whether to accept or counter or reject a Hamas ceasefire proposal. We can cross one of those options out basically right away. Israel is almost certainly not going to accept this deal. They're not, but this is still a potential turning point. Emphasis on the word potential. This is the first truce deal Hamas has agreed to in nearly 6 months. And look at this. Inside Gaza, you can see people celebrating, essentially cheering in the minutes after the news broke. A senior Arab diplomat tells our team Hamas is trying to pressure Israel into this proposal. And here's what's in it. The exchange of one Israeli hostage for 33 Palestinian prisoners and a permanent end to the fighting in Gaza, basically a permanent ceasefire. That is where things hit the brakes on this one, because Israel has said it's never going to agree to that. Now, the Israelis say they will send a delegation to get ceasefire talks going as they face a lot of pressure, not just internationally, but also from the families of hostages who say now is the time to get a deal on the table. Remember, the last hostages were released way back in November, and some of these unforgettable emotional scenes. People being released, people reuniting with their family members. Before that temporary truce ended abruptly, more than 130 hostages are still believed to be in Gaza right now. But at the moment, still a split screen as the Israeli military tells civilians in Gaza to get out of the city they were initially supposed to go to be safe as strikes in Rafah escalate tonight. People there packing up everything they own. You can see them trying to get out in this desperate race. We've got team coverage. Rafah posted up near the White House, but I want to start with Raf Sanchez in Tel Aviv. There's a lot of news just coming into us in the last couple of minutes with these two issues connected, right? The Rafah strikes and the ceasefire talks, because the threat of one has been driving the urgency of the other. Raf.
Totally connected, Hallie, and you can see it in that statement that came from the Israeli War Cabinet a little bit earlier this evening. They said they were going to do two things simultaneously. One, continue the military operation in Rafah. There is intense bombing in that southern city, even as we speak. And at the same time, they say that they are sending negotiators to Cairo to continue these talks off the back of this proposal that Hamas said it accepted earlier. Now, as you laid out, Hallie, we have a discrepancy here between what Hamas has agreed to and what Israel has agreed to. And the key task for the mediators, the Egyptians, the Qataris, CIA Director Bill Burns, in the next couple of days is going to be to see if they can close the gaps between these two understandings that Israel and Hamas have. As you said, one of the absolute key sticking points is whether they are negotiating here for a temporary pause in the fighting, with the fighting to resume on the other side of a ceasefire deal. That is what Israel says it wants, or whether they are negotiating to end the war altogether, which is what Hamas wants. Now, Hallie, there may be other discrepancies between these two texts, and we are going to find out the hard way whether they can be bridged. Hallie.
Well, I was just going to ask you, Raf, if you think, if the reporting suggests that that is the biggest discrepancy, if you will, this idea of either a permanent ceasefire or a temporary one. What else could be a sticking point here? That's clearly the biggest.
So that's likely to be the biggest, Hallie. The devil is really, really in the detail. What often happens here is first you get an agreement on the broad framework, and then you get an agreement on the details. I'll give you just another example. How quickly the hostages will be released, the so-called sequencing of releases, that is a big, big issue. It matters a lot. Our sense is that Israel and Hamas at this point are not on the same page here. There is some reporting coming out of the Arab media, not confirmed by NBC News, that when Hamas says it's prepared to release 33 hostages, it's not specifying whether those are hostages alive or dead. Israel, of course, is saying only a deal for hostages alive. We know that there are 132 hostages in Gaza altogether. Around 35 of them are confirmed dead by Israel. The suspicion is the overall number is much higher. And while Israel is, of course, interested in returning the bodies of those dead hostages, the priority, Hallie, is the living ones. And the priority of the priority are people from the so-called humanitarian category. So that is women, it's children, it's the elderly, and it's people with serious medical conditions. Hallie.
You talked about, Raf, all of this being connected to the scenes that we're seeing coming out of Rafah tonight, that critical location where, you know, months ago, civilians, innocent people in Gaza were told to go to, that it would be safer there. That has obviously changed. Now, what's the scene like on the ground, and where does that go?
There are a lot of terrified people in Rafah tonight, Hallie, including literally hundreds of thousands of children, people who have been displaced many, many times from their homes, many of them in northern Gaza. They fled, as you said, to Rafah, believing it would be safe. In many cases, it has not proved to be safe. Israel has continued to strike there. The evacuation zone right now is in the east of Rafah. There's about 100,000 people sheltering there. They've been told to head to the coast, but humanitarian agencies are saying there is nothing like the kind of infrastructure you need there: food, water, medicine, hospitals in that coastal area. The IDF is saying that that area will be safer, but they are not guaranteeing that they won't strike there. Hallie.
Raf Sanchez, thank you for that, live for us in Tel Aviv on a night of fast-moving developments. Appreciate it. Rafah is monitoring things from near the White House. Give us the perspective from down on Pennsylvania Avenue, what we're hearing from the Biden administration about this and their sense of where things stand.
We are at a critical stage right now. We got a response from Hamas. Now Director Burns is working through that, trying to assess it, working with the Israelis. I mean, my goodness, folks, I don't know that it gets any more sensitive than right now.
Well, you heard it there from John Kirby, of course, a top official there working with the National Security Council, Hallie, laying out how sensitive this moment is.
That's right, Hallie. And the White House is being very cautious about what it says about this proposal. As you saw, the National Security Council's John Kirby saying that right now the White House is reviewing Hamas's response to it. He said that they will be speaking with Middle Eastern leaders the rest of the day about that response, but he didn't offer too much more, just stressing how sensitive and critical these talks are right now. He also said that he didn't want to jeopardize revealing anything that was specifically mentioned in this deal. And another thing that Kirby talked about in that briefing is that he said the progress that has been made on these ceasefire talks largely was in part due to the efforts of the Biden administration, most specifically and most recently by CIA Director Bill Burns, who was in Doha for days working with key negotiators on this proposal, who is now in Israel. And a large part of his role now that he is in Israel is going to be adding pressure on the Israelis to, as you heard Raf mention, come up with some bridge, some agreement with Hamas to this proposal, but also pressure them to not go forward with this full-blown ground offensive into Rafah. Obviously, this news today of these evacuation orders adding to the urgency of that. And we know that the president repeatedly stressed that to Prime Minister Netanyahu, most recently on a call that they shared this morning, talking about how the U.S. would not support any ground offensive in Rafah without a robust plan to protect those civilians that have been sheltering there. So that is really something that we're continuing to watch as these movements into Rafah continue. Really, the more precarious of a position the president is put in as we see Netanyahu defy clearly his wishes, Hallie.
Rafah, live for us there outside the White House. Thank you very much. To the central part of the country now, with 18 million people across Texas, Kansas, and Oklahoma under the highest level tornado risk warning that exists. Very rare to hit a level 5 on that, but that is what's happening as we speak. A level 5 for those folks. The last time the Weather Service put out a warning like that, 131 tornadoes hit 11 states. This is another potential punch after a round of severe storms slammed Texas. Nearly 600 people had to be rescued or evacuated by first responders after deadly flooding there. You're looking at some of these images. It's pretty unbelievable. Some people were trapped in their homes or stranded on their roofs. Look at this. There's a trailer empty, floating away. Others had to be rescued on jet skis, essentially. And a 4-year-old boy was killed after he was swept away after his car got caught up in the flooding. Now there's more potentially devastating weather on the way. We've got team coverage. Bill Karen standing by with the forecast. But I want to start with Priscilla Thompson live for us in Texas, where there is already so much damage. It looks like, Priscilla, based on what I've seen from you today, the floodwater has started to go down. But the question is, what's next?
Yeah, Hallie, so the floodwater has gone down significantly in terms of the roads being back open. We're actually here about 50 yards away from a river. And so as you can see, that water is making its way back into the rivers and the lakes here so that people are able to get back into their homes and survey the damage. And that is what's really going to be the next part of this for folks in Southeast Texas. It's going to be surveying that damage and figuring out how to begin to rebuild. But at the same time, as you mentioned, there is that severe weather another threat that is impacting parts of North Texas with the potential for tornadoes and some severe weather there, moving on into Oklahoma and up to Nebraska. But thankfully for folks here, the water is receding. The sun is out. That's helping to dry things out. There are more than 90 counties that have had that are under a state of emergency right now. A disaster declaration, has been declared, and that's according to the governor. And we're also now learning that it was at least two people who have died as a result of this flooding and this rain. But when you look at the amount of area that was touched by this, you look at the amount of rescues, now up to more than 600, and evacuations that first responders had to respond to. It is pretty remarkable that there were not more lives lost or serious injuries. So lots of folks counting their blessings today as they figure out how to move forward. Hallie?
Priscilla Thompson live for us there in Texas. Thank you. Bill Cairns, let me bring you in here. And I understand that in just even the last half an hour, we've heard reports of some more activity. We just don't know how bad it is yet, right, with the worst yet to come?
Yeah, we're just at the beginning of our tornado outbreak, Hallie. We only get a situation like this once or twice a year. I mean, there are probably thousands of tornado chasers out in the Central Plains. So if we get a tornado, we will know it pretty instantly. Of course, once the sun sets and it's dark, that's a different story. So you can kind of see how this bullseye goes here. This is the area of greatest concern, this high risk. That's what is very rare. Again, when we get that pink color, and it includes Oklahoma City, just about up to Wichita. So if we get really big, strong tornadoes, that's where they're likely to occur in the next 6 hours. And then later this evening, this line of storms will head towards Kansas City by about midnight, Springfield and Fort Smith, Arkansas, probably about 1 or 2 a.m. So this is going to go well into the night and keep a lot of people up. And they're going to be monitoring the situation in case they get in their storm shelters. Not a night to fall asleep and not have any alerts or warnings where you can get to safety if you need be it. So this is what we call a PDS. This is a particularly dangerous situation. So all the time we're like, we have a tornado watch or we have a severe thunderstorm watch. This is a particularly dangerous situation, tornado watch. That means that we're expecting not just tornadoes, but strong tornadoes.
And that's the worst one, right, Bill?
That's the highest category.
If you see a PDS, don't mess around. That's the real deal.
Make sure you have your family plan to get to safety if you need it. And I'm just noticing our first tornado warning of the afternoon and evening coming in now outside of Woodward. So this is one strong storm here in central Kansas. I'll go back down to that new tornado warning. And when we start to get the hooks on these, that's when we're going to worry. So if this does develop a tornado, Hallie, we would likely be tracking this for the next 2 hours, 3 hours straight with it on the ground. So that's what we're going to be paying attention to. So right now, tornado sirens are going off, and in Avard and Alva and Waynoka, these people are all getting to their shelters immediately, and we'll continue to track this through the night here.
Bill Cairns, you got a busy night ahead of you. Thank you. We'll check back in with you, I know, throughout the night as this continues to develop. Appreciate it. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, I-95 in Connecticut is now back open and good to go after a fuel truck, remember, collided with 2 other cars and burst into flames a few days ago. Crews also had to, you see it there, crews also had to tear down a bridge because of heat damage from the crash. Number 2, some Planters nuts are getting recalled today because of a potential listeria contamination that can be pretty dangerous. This affects some of the mixed nuts and honey roasted peanuts with best by dates of April 2025 and 26. No reports of anybody getting sick, but the manufacturer says they're recalling them out of an abundance of caution. Number 3, a daily dose of olive oil now associated with a lower risk of dying from dementia, according to a new Harvard study. And you only need a couple teaspoons a day, apparently, linked to a nearly 30% decrease in your risk. Researchers think it may be because of certain antioxidants in olive oil. Number 4, you are looking at some of the red carpet looks at this year's Met Gala. It is early yet. It's really just starting on the red carpet. Some birds in a cape thing, I guess, there. The theme is Sleeping Beauties, reawakening fashion. And the dress code, what everybody's dressing for tonight, is Garden of Time. The year's co-chairs include Zendaya, Bad Bunny, Jennifer Lopez. This is a live picture. That's why it's a little bit fuzzy. But hey, the action is beginning on fashion's biggest night. Birds. Number 5, bread. We got it all on this show tonight, folks. French bakers breaking the record for the world's longest baguette, 460 feet long. The Italians were the last record holders with a 435-foot piece of bread in 2019. It's a wide range of news stories. When we come back, we're going to take you to another one. This one out of the Pentagon, because officials say that an American soldier has been detained in Russia. We're just getting some new details into us. We'll tell you what he's accused of doing. Plus, have you seen this video? It is very scary. Look at that. A deacon having a gun pulled on him in church. We'll show you what was caught on the live stream and how this ended. Some breaking news into us tonight. First to NBC News, with U.S. officials saying an American soldier has been detained in Russia. This is somebody who was apparently stationed in Korea and then traveled to Russia on his own. He's being accused of theft. Courtney Cuby is all over this story. She's joining us now. Court, what else do we know?
Yeah, so we've just actually learned his name, Hallie. His name is Staff Sergeant Gordon Black. As you mentioned, he had been serving in Korea. He was deployed there. He was actually coming back to the United States when he made this side trip to Vladivostok, Russia. And we're told, according to officials here, that he was there to visit a woman he may have been romantically linked to. Now, at some point during this trip, which, by the way, was not approved by his superiors, he did not get clearance or approval to travel to Russia. At some point on Thursday, he was detained by Russian authorities. They're saying he was involved in some criminal misconduct. Officials say it had something to do with stealing from this woman who he went there to visit, Hallie. At this point, he's in pretrial confinement, but that's about all we know. The State Department is saying that they are actively seeking to get consular access to him now, Hallie.
Okay, and I might be 6 steps too far now, right? In the process of okay, well, what happens? How do you get this person out of detention in Russia? Because I think everybody thinks of detention in Russia and probably thinks of Evan Gershkovich, of course, that detained Wall Street Journal reporter. Obviously a different situation for a couple of reasons. Number one, the U.S. has made the assessment that Gershkovich has been wrongfully detained. There's Paul Whelan, of course, who's detained in Russia too. Civilians. Do things change when it's an active military person?
Yeah, yes, it has to, right? Now, that being said, we don't know we don't know in what direction it's going to change. And the reality is every single one of these cases, as we've seen, has been its individual case and hasn't played out in the same way as others. You know, so that's a great question. I think what we're waiting for now is to see, you know, where exactly is he being held and in what conditions? State Department still has not been able to talk to him. They've notified his family that he's been detained, but that's about it. You know, they're still trying to get some kind of access to him. At this point, officials are concerned that he will be held in pretrial confinement for a number of weeks before they even have an opportunity to speak to him.
Courtney Cuby live for us there at the Pentagon Court. Thank you very much for watching all of that for us tonight. Appreciate it. NBC News covers hundreds of other stories every day, and because it can be tough to read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. Out of our Northeast Bureau, police arresting a man in Pennsylvania after this terrifying moment. You see that? He holds up a gun to a pastor in the middle of a sermon. The gun did not go off. A deacon then runs over, tackles him. It is so scary to look at. This is all basically captured off this live stream there. The pastor says this man actually apologized to him later. Hours after that, police found one of the suspect's relatives dead at home. They say they're investigating. Out of our Western Bureau, crews rescuing an 18-year-old who fell something like 30 feet inside an abandoned missile silo. Basically, he and a few other teenagers in Colorado crawled through a broken gate at the entrance, and then he fell in. It took hours for rescuers to get him out. He was airlifted to a local hospital in serious condition. And out of our Southern Bureau, a couple was just driving along the highway in Arizona when they noticed an extra little passenger, little snake climbing up there, tucked inside the windshield. How'd they handle it? Well, they pulled off at the next exit, and the snake just took off on its own. All right. Coming up, much more to get to, including our live at the Kennedy Space Center, because Boeing is doing something it has never done before, launching astronauts into space. We'll tell you how much is riding on this test after a series of setbacks, delays, and a new investigation we've just learned about. We're going to have that right after the break. The FAA late today rolling out a new investigation into Boeing after the company acknowledged some of its employees skipped certain safety inspections on its 787 Dreamliner planes. That news dropping just hours before a moment that Boeing hopes will be a reason to celebrate. That's because later tonight, the company is going to try to launch 2 astronauts to the International Space Station on its Starliner spacecraft. And listen, Boeing wants this to work, right? They need this to work. Obviously, not just from a safety perspective. There are lives on the line here, but perhaps for perception reasons, too, at a time when the company's reputation has taken a bunch of hits, going back to those deadly crashes on the 737 MAX plane several years ago. This year, there was that blown-out door plug incident on the Alaska Airlines flight. In March, the company's CEO says he'll step down as Boeing's trying to navigate Senate hearings, investigations, et cetera, including the one we just learned about today. NBC's Tom Costello is joining us from Florida's Kennedy Space Center. I definitely want to get to the Starliner launch in a second because that's a huge deal for Boeing. It's a big deal for space travel generally. Yeah. But let me just quickly start with this FAA investigation we've just learned about. What should we know?
Bottom line here is that the FAA says Boeing came forward. An employee saw something and said something. And that employee said, I think employees may have signed off on paperwork pledging that, in fact, inspections had occurred when they hadn't occurred. Specifically, looking at whether the wings were properly attached to the fuselage, the bonding, as well as the wiring. That's a serious problem. If they've signed paperwork saying inspections were done and they weren't done, that is falsification of airline records. That immediately involves an FAA investigation, could also involve a criminal investigation. So the FAA says it is now looking at this. Boeing says it came forward, it raised the flag and self-reported. And at the same time now, Boeing's got an even bigger problem with another plane. Now they've got to try to inspect every 787 still on the production line and then decide what they do about planes that are flying already. Boeing says it has no reason to believe that this is a safety of flight issue, but this is, yet again, Boeing in the spotlight for quality control.
Well, and so that is the backdrop to this moment, the reason why you're down south for us right now with this live shot here. Boeing really wants a win here, and this Starliner thing could be it for Boeing. How are folks there feeling about it? Are they nervous? Are they excited? All of the above?
Yeah, all of the above, absolutely. But let's not forget, 2 lives are on the line here.
That's right.
2 veteran astronauts, Sunita Williams and Butch Wilmore. They are veteran NASA astronauts. They are veteran Navy test pilots. They will climb into the Starliner tonight for a 10:30 p.m. liftoff. And all systems are go right now. But to your point about the troubled history here, it was back in 2019. I was here. We had the first uncrewed test flight for Starliner. It lifted off, and then they had a major malfunction. They had to abort. They found out that software errors had allowed the computers inside the spaceship to be off by 11 hours. The clocks were off by 11 hours. Fast forward, they had another problem. They realized that, in fact, they weren't ready to fly in 2022. And then they also discovered in 2023, last June, that they had flammable tape inside the spaceship. Flammable, remember Apollo 1, where the astronauts burned to death? And they had parachute straps that might not be strong enough. So they delayed again until today. Now they say they're convinced the spaceship is ready to go, and it's going to go up at 10:34 p.m. Eastern time. And everybody here is watching. Everybody wants this to go off well.
You know who else is probably watching? Their competitors over at SpaceX. Fair?
100%. I mean, listen, who would have thought? If you would have asked me 5 years ago, who's going to be the first to get to the space station, Boeing or SpaceX, that young upstart, the whippersnappers? I would have said, oh, Boeing, by far, right? They were behind Apollo. And they have still not gotten a crew to the space station, while SpaceX has flown 11 crewed missions to the space station. So Boeing has lost a ton of money. It's over budget. It's overdue. And the pressure is on. They've got to deliver. They've got to deliver tonight. But most importantly, they've got to make sure that these astronauts' lives are protected, that they get there and get home safely.
Tom Costello at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. We should note that NBC News Now will have that live coverage tonight, right ahead of that launch at 10:30 Eastern time. Tom, we'll be talking again, I am sure. Thank you so much, friend. Appreciate it. Lots more still to come on the show, including the former leader of Starbucks saying that the experience at the stores these days kind of stinks. They need to get back on their coffee grind. We'll explain what the company's doing about it now. New fallout tonight from what experts say is a pretty extraordinary open letter from the former head of Starbucks, blasting his old company, basically saying they've got to get back to basics like good coffee and good service. Howard Schultz now saying stores have to have, I'm quoting here, a maniacal focus on the customer experience. Another ding at Starbucks, which is getting hammered by investors. Look at its stock price, down something like 30% since last May. Brian Chung is joining us now. One of the most iconic brands in the world. You can go anywhere and find a Starbucks, right? They're huge. But Howard Schultz is basically saying, okay, instead of like spicy lemonade, focus more on like eliminating long lines. You've even got Jim Cramer, who folks over, know it, our friends at CNBC. He's saying today he's never seen anything like what Schultz is doing. Why now?
Yeah, and he had an interview with his CEO, our colleagues over at CNBC, basically asking him, impressing him on the earnings results, which was really the nexus for this entire conversation. Starbucks, the company, reporting last week that their revenue and also their bottom line earnings were well below what Wall Street economists or what Wall Street analysts had been expecting. Moreover, they also had guidance, which is basically the projection for how much money they're going to make in the future, that were slashed compared to the last time they offered projections about 3 months ago. And one big story behind all this appears to be that customers that only go to Starbucks on a casual basis are simply not going there anymore. If you're a loyal customer who goes day after day after day, you're probably still going, but it's the casual consumers, which they rely on so much for the remainder of the revenue, that don't appear to be coming into the store as much. How do they get that back up? They're saying it's going to be based off of the app. They're going to try to push more promos. We'll see if that works.
Do you see any degree of like CEO corner office drama here? Like, is that what Schultz might be planning?
Yeah, well, we have to remember that Howard Schultz has had instances in his career where he has left Starbucks and then come back. He left the position as CEO in 2000, stayed within the company, but then came back during the financial crisis in 2008, and then he left again later on. He then returned briefly in 2022 on an interim basis while they were trying to find a successor, which they found a few months after that. So Howard Schultz has been kind of the North Star for this company, and him kind of posting on LinkedIn suggests that he's very much dialed into this company still. Could that be something where the board says, all right, Howard's got some thoughts, maybe we should give him a ring and bring him back again? That's very much part of the speculation today, although, of course, it remains to be seen.
What are people so annoyed about with Starbucks? Like, is it the long lines? Is it that it's getting expensive? Like, what is the issue for customers?
Yeah, well, I mean, it does appear to be, on one hand, a function of the inflationary environment that we're in. I mean, not many people want to go to Starbucks, get a cold brew with sweet cream foam on top, and then end up $7 deep in the hole when they walk out. But they are a premium product, right? They're supposed to be more expensive than Dunkin' Donuts. So you look at food spending, people are spending, but are they choosing to get more bang for the buck by maybe getting a coffee and a donut somewhere else? Maybe.
Brian Chong, thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. That does it for us for this hour. We've got more coverage picking up right now. We are coming on the air with a lot developing in the Middle East tonight. News strikes in Gaza. At the same time, Israel's considering a ceasefire deal. We're live in Tel Aviv with what could happen next and what's happening as we speak. Plus, back here at home, millions across the central U.S. getting a very rare warning tonight. The risk for super powerful tornadoes, maybe dozens of them. What's making tonight's weather some of the most dangerous all year. Then the big headline out of former President Trump's criminal trial tonight. Potential jail time if he doesn't get a handle on what he's saying. Why the former president seemed kind of unfazed leaving court. Plus, some breaking news first to NBC. An American soldier detained in Russia. We'll tell you what he's being accused of doing. Plus, the moment a Sunday afternoon church service was very dramatically interrupted by a man with a gun. Look at this, pointing it right at the pastor. We'll tell you how this deacon ended up saving the day and how the whole thing ended later in the show. Hey there, I'm Hallie, and right now it is just after 1 a.m. in the Middle East. It is 1:01 at a critical moment in the war between Israel and Hamas. The Israelis stepping up attacks into a major Gaza city. At the same time, it considers whether to accept or counter or reject a Hamas ceasefire proposal. We can cross one of those options out basically right away, okay? That's the accept option. Cross it off the list because Israel is almost certainly not going to accept this deal. But this moment is still a potential turning point. Emphasis on the word potential. This is the first truce deal that Hamas has agreed to in nearly 6 months. And you can see the reaction inside Gaza. Look at this. People celebrating, cheering in the minutes after that news came out. A senior Arab diplomat tells our team Hamas is trying to pressure Israel into this proposal. And here's what's in it. The exchange of one Israeli hostage for 33 Palestinian prisoners and a permanent stop to the fighting in Gaza. Look at this word, permanently. That's the sticking point, right? That's where things hit the brakes because Israel has said it would never agree to that. Now, the Israelis say they will send a delegation to keep ceasefire talks going as they're facing a lot of pressure, not just internationally, but also from families of hostages who say now is the time to get a deal on the table. Remember, the last hostages were released back in November. These unforgettable emotional scenes, people getting released, people reuniting with their family members. Before that temporary ceasefire ended pretty suddenly. More than 130 hostages are still believed to be in Gaza right now. But at the moment, still a split screen as the Israeli military tells civilians in Gaza to get out of the city they were initially supposed to go to be safe, with strikes there escalating. Again, 1 a.m., we have seen some of those strikes throughout the night, and you see people there packing up, trying to get everything they own out. I want to get to Rafah Sanchez, who's live for us in Tel Aviv. We know these things are connected, the Rafah strikes plus the ceasefire talks, because the threat of one has been driving the urgency of the other. We were waiting to hear what the Israeli war cabinet would do, and now we have some signals, right? Tell us more.
Hallie, they are absolutely connected, and you can see that connection in the statement that came out of the Israeli war cabinet a little earlier. They said they were going to do two things simultaneously. Number one, they are going to continue this military operation in the city of Rafah, and tonight we are seeing reports of widespread Israeli strikes across that city. They said at the same time, Hallie, that they would send negotiators back to the ceasefire talks in Cairo after this response from Hamas to see if these gaps can be bridged, to see if a final deal can be reached. But the Israelis have been really clear. They believe that putting pressure on Hamas on the battlefield inside of Gaza is a way to get results at the negotiating table. But what we have at this point, Hallie, is a discrepancy between what Hamas has agreed to and what Israel has agreed to. And the task for the mediators over the next couple of days is going to be figuring out how big are those gaps, can they be bridged, and that is going to fall to the Egyptians, to the Qataris, and to CIA Director Bill Burns, who has been crisscrossing the Middle East over the last couple of days, trying to get this deal over the line. Hallie.
We're showing some of the details of the framework that Hamas has agreed to, but as you point out, there's obviously a question of what Israel is going to agree to here. And in the meantime, they seem to be moving forward now with attacks on Rafah. This is really complicated because it is the place where months ago, civilians, innocent people in Gaza, were told to head to if they wanted to try to get out of the line of fire.
That's exactly right. There are 1 million Palestinian civilians sheltering in Rafah, most of them displaced from their homes further north in Gaza. They went to Rafah believing it would be safe, and tonight it is the scene of intense Israeli bombing. There are reports, Hallie, on social media from people on the ground that Israeli ground forces have entered into Rafah. We asked the Israeli military about that earlier. They would neither confirm nor deny. But earlier on today, they dropped thousands of leaflets from the sky with a pretty stark message for Palestinian civilians. Get out of the area. We are going to attack. Around 100,000 people in the area Israel is ordering to evacuate. They've been told to go to a humanitarian zone, so-called humanitarian zone, on the Mediterranean coast. But, Hallie, humanitarian groups have been really clear. There is not the level of infrastructure there on the beach in terms of food, in terms of water, in terms of medicine, in terms of field hospitals to support 1 million people. You have seen the Biden administration consistently saying it is opposed to any large-scale Israeli ground offensive in Rafah. You've seen the UN warning that an Israeli attack would be a catastrophe in terms of the loss of innocent lives, but also disruption to the flow of humanitarian aid through that critical Rafah crossing. There is fighting going on tonight. Whether this is the beginning of the large-scale operation or whether this is something more surgical, it's likely where we'll find out when the sun comes up. Hallie.
Raf, I'm going to ask you to lean on your many years of reporting from the region and your expertise in reporting on this issue. It's 1:05 there where you are in Tel Aviv. It has been a very long day, a very long night for Israelis, for those in Gaza. Is there something that we should be talking about that hasn't been talked about enough, in your view, in some of the coverage?
Is there something we should be talking about? I mean, just the desperation, Hallie, of these Palestinian civilians in Gaza who have moved again and again and again, trying to get somewhere safe. Tonight, many of them are fleeing on the back of donkey-drawn carts. Many of them are going on foot. They're leaving tents that they built, with bare hands. And similarly, Hallie, not far from where we are right now, earlier tonight, the families of Israeli hostages were blocking the highway here in Tel Aviv, just pleading with their own government 7 months into this to bring their loved ones home. Hallie.
Rafah Sanchez, thank you. Live for us in Tel Aviv. We will see what the morning brings. Appreciate it. Ali Rafah is posted up near the White House. Give us a perspective from here at home, from the Biden administration on this.
Yeah, Hallie, well, the Biden administration is being very cautious when talking about this proposal that they say Hamas is still reviewing, that U.S. officials are still reviewing. They say that they don't want to speculate as to what details are in this as they continue speaking with Arab leaders, Middle Eastern leaders about this proposal. But what we do know today, some news that was made, is that there is a large weapons shipment, a delivery to Israel by the U.S. that last week has been paused. And we understand that, barring any technical issues in the past that have prevented these weapons deliveries, that this is the first time that has happened. And we know that U.S. officials have been considering slowing down weapons deliveries for months now, but haven't made this official move. Now, the White House is not confirming that this has happened. They're not talking about why it has happened. They're also denying that this rare move is indicative of any policy change. But the timing of this is significant, Hallie, as you heard Raf mention, that the IDF is preparing for this looming ground offensive in Rafah. That's something that President Biden has repeatedly told Prime Minister Netanyahu that he would not support unless the Israelis have a robust plan to protect the more than 1 million Palestinians who have been sheltering in that area. And a State Department spokesperson gave an update on those plans today. Listen here.
We have not seen a humanitarian plan that is credible and that is implementable, and we believe a military operation in Rafah right now would dramatically increase the suffering of the Palestinian people. We have made clear that we do not support Israel launching a full-scale military operation in Rafah.
You'll remember, Hallie, that the president told Netanyahu on that high-stakes call they shared about a month ago now that he said U.S. policy towards Israel would change if Netanyahu didn't do more to protect innocent civilians in Gaza. There's really no details as to what he meant by that policy change, but we're told from sources familiar that he hinted to Netanyahu that that could include conditioning these U.S. weapons deliveries. And while we know that this isn't meant to completely prevent any ground invasion of Gaza, we do know that the weapons that were intended to be shipped would have made a difference in that ground offensive, Hallie.
Rafah, thank you very much for that outside the White House for us tonight. Appreciate it. Out in the center of the country, some 18 million people across Texas, Kansas, and Oklahoma are under the highest level tornado risk warning that exists. This is as bad as it gets. Very rare. A level 5. That's what's happening as we speak. The last time the Weather Service put out a warning like this, 131 tornadoes hit 11 states. It is another potential punch after a round of severe storms hit Texas. You're looking at some of the aftermath there. Yes, those are dogs getting rescued on a jet ski. And it wasn't just dogs, people too, nearly 600 of them who had to be rescued or evacuated by first responders after deadly flooding there. You're seeing that empty trailer just floating away. You had some folks trapped in their homes, stranded on their roofs. Look at that. You see some of these rescues. 4-year-old boy was killed after he was swept away after his car got caught up in the flooding, the car he was in. And now there's more potentially devastating weather on the way. We've got team coverage, Bill Cairns with the forecast, and Priscilla Thompson in Texas. Bill, let me start with you because you've got an active tornado warning on the ground right now in the center part of the country. Talk us through it. What's happening? How bad is it? And where does it go?
So we've about 7 hours to go in this tornado threat zone. We're only about 1 or 2 hours into it. We've had 2 tornadoes that have been reported, no damage whatsoever. But now we're watching these storms getting into that high risk, that level 5 out of 5, where they could be strong tornadoes on the ground for a long period of time. So here's one of the tornado warnings we're watching here. And this has not been confirmed. This is what we call radar indicated. The radar showing that the storm is spinning. It could drop a tornado at any time. And that's near Avard, Oklahoma. Further to the south, this storm looking a little more menacing now. Again, this is radar indicated, but you can see this big pink blob. That's the hail we're watching. And then the hook right here is where the tornado is trying to form. One thing that's pretty cool that we can do is we can actually slice the storm in half, and I can kind of show you what it looks like. And this is the hail shaft in this storm. It goes up now to about 30,000 feet. So if there was an airliner, if you're in a plane going across the country, typically you fly about 35,000 feet right here. So this is one of these storms that's so big and high in the atmosphere that the airlines are flying around these storms, and there would be a lot of turbulence anywhere near these storm systems anyways. So as far as what we're going to deal with the rest of today, this PDS is where the storms are. I just showed you. This means a potentially dangerous situation. It's not your typical tornado watch. This means life-threatening tornadoes are expected. Not just a chance, but expected in the next 7 hours. And this will be a threat towards Oklahoma City. The latest guidance shows like 10 p.m. tonight. So that's a scary situation for people, putting their kids to bed. You have to make sure you're listening. You have all your phones on, your TV, your radio, so we can get get your warnings and get the shelter if needed, because of the tornadoes we're expecting, Hallie, tonight. They're the kinds that can hit a town and destroy a town, or if we're lucky, they'll be out in a farmer's field and do no damage at all except to the crops. That's best case scenario tonight, but we know we're going to have these really strong tornadoes in this area, and this hatched area here that goes from Kansas all the way down here to the Texas border. This is where the potential is for any of those super strong tornadoes. And unfortunately, we're going to do this again tomorrow. It looks like a chance of strong tornadoes, Indiana into areas of Ohio. And then we're going to go all the way back into the middle of the country again on Wednesday. A huge, almost 50 million people at risk from Little Rock to St. Louis. Hallie, this week will rival last week, which was incredibly active, destructive, and deadly. We're hoping to avoid that today, but the potential is there. We're just trying to get people as much warning and heads up as possible.
Yeah, that's it. It's all about paying attention to the warnings and taking them seriously. Bill Cairns, thank you very much. Long night ahead for you. Appreciate it. Priscilla, where you are, it's been several long nights for folks dealing with so much flooding there. And now the long road to recovery. Talk us through it.
Yeah, so right now, all of that water that we saw, some areas getting more than 2 feet over the past several days, is receding. Officials say that the rivers and the lakes are going down quicker than they had even predicted. And that is very good news because it's allowing for the roads to reopen, for people to get back into their homes and begin to do what they need to do to clean up. And that is something that is really important after flooding. If you want to save your home, you need to get in there, get the standing water out, take out the sheetrock, and try to get a hold on any potential for mold before that happens. And so that is what officials are really telling people to focus on, gutting their homes, getting the mud out, getting all those wet things out, and getting the standing water out is a big one. They're concerned about mosquitoes here. Mosquitoes breed in that standing water, and so they've got mosquito trucks that are going to be coming out because that is another potential threat. But right now, the thing on people's minds is really cleaning up. And we spoke to one man who lives just up the street from here as he was tearing up floorboards and throwing out couches. And I want to play a little bit about what he had to say about what has happened here.
We got 18 inches of water in the house. We're used to flooding, and we're used to the process that kind of comes with that. It's not fun, but and it's a big inconvenience, but when you have memories and you've lived here your whole life, it's just kind of part of it.
And that's what we've heard from a lot of people that we've spoken to throughout this community. They do plan to rebuild. They want to keep their memories here. And a lot of them, everyone that we've spoken to, I will say, has some type of insurance. And so they're not as concerned about how they're going to rebuild, just a matter of getting it done so that they can get back into their homes. Hallie?
Priscilla Thompson live for us there in Kingwood, Texas. Priscilla, thank you. Let's take you over to Manhattan with court wrapping up in just the last maybe 90 minutes or so in former President Trump's criminal trial. And the testimony today pushed us into the nitty-gritty of the alleged hush money scheme at the center of what's happening in court. But the headline, or maybe shadow, looming over Mr. Trump now, and the thing we heard him talk about in the hallway on his way out of court, that warning from the judge that the former president, a guy who could maybe be the next president, could end up in a jail cell if he's not more careful about what he says. Tonight, we're hearing Mr. Trump sounding, well, unfazed. Listen.
This judge has given me a gag order and said you'll go to jail if you violate it. And frankly, you know what? Our Constitution is much more important than jail. It's not even close. I'll do that sacrifice any day.
Well, the judge really seemed at the end of his rope here. It didn't even sound like he wants to do this, right? He told Mr. Trump to his face, the last thing I want to do is put you in jail. He said, you're the former president and possibly the next president. He said, but as much as I do not want to propose it, I will if necessary. That was the rare firework in a day that consisted mostly of what you could call some legally necessary slogging for the prosecutors, with a couple of new witnesses very carefully laying out the process of reimbursing Michael Cohen $130,000 and Mr. Trump's participation in that process. Remember, prosecutors say that money, that $130 grand, was allegedly paid to keep two women who claimed to have had affairs with Mr. Trump quiet, affairs that the former president denies. Today, the jury is getting its first look at those checks in question, allegedly used to reimburse Cohen for a retainer. The prosecutors say that retainer never existed. It's the reason this whole trial is happening. That's what's at the core of these 34 counts of falsifying business records that the former president has pleaded not guilty to. NBC legal analyst Danny Savalos is with us, but I want to start with Vaughn Hilliard outside court in New York. So two buckets here, right? Let's start with the one that we heard from Donald Trump about late today as he was leaving court. The warning from the judge that if Donald Trump does not abide by this partial gag order, that he could face the inside of a jail cell. He said it's a sacrifice he seems willing to make. Give us a gut check.
Right, Hallie. This is now the 10th violation of this gag order since it was placed on him at the beginning of this trial. We're starting week 4 now here. And clearly the words of Judge Merchan were very direct, that he wanted to avoid having to go to those lengths to imprison, as he said, the former president and potentially the future president. But just look at part of his gag order in which he was very specific about why he may potentially have to take those steps. He says in part, quote, "It is apparent that monetary fines have not and will not suffice to deter defendant from violating this court's lawful orders. Therefore, defendant is hereby put on notice that if appropriate and warranted, future violations of its lawful orders will be punishable by incarceration." This being made clear by the judge that he is willing to do it if it were to get to that point. Of course, the concern for the judge in the court is that witnesses are intimidated, but also that the jury could very well be tainted as well if he were to further violate this gag order.
Talk about today's testimony, because it felt like a bit of a shift now, right? Last week, it was all about some of these salacious, more lurid stories. We had, like, Hulk Hogan's name come up for various reasons. We had, Hope Hicks, the former president's former closest confidant, tearing up on the stand, right? There were fireworks, if you will. Now, this is prosecutors, it seems, shifting to the more weedsy parts of their case, right? The dotting of the T's or the I's, the crossing of the T's, et cetera, et cetera. What was it like in court? And explain why it's so critical that what the prosecution is doing is laying the stakes for the jury.
Right. Well, last week was adult film stars and the National Enquirer. This week's accountants. Nothing against accountants. Yeah. But what you heard from were two individuals today here who were in charge of keeping the books for the Trump organization. We love them all. And guess what? Every accountant watching and listening to this would probably repeat exactly what Jeffrey McConney and the individual who was actually in charge of executing the checks for the Trump organization, they were the two witnesses today, and they were the ones that were ultimately responsible for getting those reimbursement checks from Donald Trump to go back to Michael Cohen here. And this is where you get into the nitty-gritty. And it was even part of the testimony here that the record keeping and the books are very important and taken very seriously, even by allies of Donald Trump. And if you just look here at what was part of that testimony here today, there was discussion when it came to ultimately the prosecution asking Jeffrey McConney, who is the controller overseeing the accounting department for the Trump organization, the question, quote, "Did you ever see a retainer agreement?" To which McConney said, "I did not." Why is that important? Well, Donald Trump said that he was making legal expenses and had a legal retainer agreement with Michael Cohen. But what the prosecution is alleging is that actually he was just repaying Michael Cohen for the hush money to Stormy Daniels before the 2016 election. And so having his own employee of 35 years today testify that there was actually no ever legal retainer on file is notable for this jury here. Well, Donald Trump and his defense team make the case that that's what the payments were for, not for the Stormy Daniels payment before the election, Hallie.
Vaughn Hilliard live for us there in downtown Manhattan. Thanks. Danny, let me go to you here, because if there was a star of the show today, it was a Sharpie. Explain that.
That was a Sharpie. It was how Donald Trump signs his checks, which is, like all things Trump, his signature. If you've seen it, it's huge already, and the Sharpie is very glaring. I mean, you could argue, normally you need, there are rules of evidence about authenticating things like signatures, but there's a pretty good argument to be made that everybody in America is familiar with Donald Trump's signature because it's appeared on so many documents on TV. But, Hallie, going back to something else that's been said many times today, that today was about getting into the weeds, right? There's this expectation in this trial that if it's not porn stars or Playboy models, it's somehow not exciting. Today was in the world of white-collar crime.
That's not our perception, but it is the reality, right? I mean, it is no less important, right? But it is less salacious. It just factually is.
Right. But it's not even that dry when you think about the context or the spectrum of how boring some white-collar cases can get. This isn't even all that bad, because people can understand check paid to so-and-so. People can follow, regular folks can follow those. A lot of times in these white-collar cases, when you start talking about structuring and the complexities of money laundering, it can get really confusing and really, really dull, especially with banking records. So far, there really hasn't been that problem. I mean, the jurors can follow a check paid to Cohen and Cohen a check to Stormy Daniels. Now, they layered it up to try to make it confusing, but ironically, all this effort to obfuscate really resulted in a paper trail that isn't that difficult to follow. So, you know, all in all, this is the kind of evidence that I think jurors can digest, even if, as you say, I agree, it is technically more weedsy. But, you know, this is, again, a trial with, you know, Hulk Hogan and all kinds of celebrities getting name dropped. So, yes, this is the less exciting, but in my view, more critical, more important part of the case.
That said, right, so, okay, that's sort of the one bucket, right? What happened in court, which you would describe, and I think compellingly so, is key moments here in the case. There's this other threat that we talked about from the judge. I would call it maybe more of a warning here, that Mr. Trump could potentially face time in a jail cell if he continues to violate that partial gag order that the judge has placed on him. That is the warning, right? Back us into the realistic gut check of the likelihood of that actually happening. Is that the next step on the ladder? Is it possible the judge could stick him in more of like a timeout in a holding area? Like, what really could be done here? Because the judge did acknowledge, like, Secret Service and the unprecedented nature of all this. Like, he's clearly thought it through.
Yeah, it was so interesting to hear the judge say what I've been thinking and others like me have been thinking for weeks now, which is that no judge wants to try to put Donald Trump in jail. And I admire that he flat out said it. Look, it's going to be an administrative nightmare. I don't want to do it. So what I anticipate happening is I rather think Trump will reel it in a little bit. So even if we do have further gag order violation hearings, there'll be closer calls. I don't anticipate Trump going out and saying something about a juror. But if he does, the path is clear. I mean, he can't dare the judge any longer. The next steps, if it's obvious and blatant, will possibly be jail. If it's a close call, look for more $1,000 fines.
Real quick, Danny, the prosecution also said that 2 weeks from tomorrow is when they anticipate wrapping this portion of their presentation, this part of the case. What, for those of us looking at our calendars and wondering when this case might end up in the hands of the jury, what's your best guess?
Best guess is, I say no more than a week for the defense. The defense's case is always much less than the prosecution's case, and that's because the defense has no burden. So you, generally speaking, don't want to start calling witnesses unless you absolutely need them, unless they're part of your affirmative defense or something like that. So I don't think their case is going to be as long, but safe bet at least a week or maybe just a week after the prosecution closes. But I agree, they've moved quickly. And Hallie, I would argue that they really don't need that much more in this case, other than maybe Michael Cohen, if he's going to testify that Trump told me to do this. That's going to be key. But I don't even know that you need a Stormy Daniels. I definitely don't think you need a Karen McDougal, even though everybody wants to see those people testify.
Danny Savalas, thank you very much. Let's take you to the Pentagon now, because we've got some breaking news into us tonight. We've just learned the name of the American soldier who officials say is being detained in Russia. Staff Sergeant Gordon Black, stationed in Korea, headed to Russia on his own with no permission from supervisors after his deployment ended. He's now being held in pretrial confinement there, accused of theft. Courtney Kuby is all over this story. She's joining us now. What else do we know?
Yeah, so we've just actually learned his name, Hallie. His name is Staff Sergeant Gordon Black. As you mentioned, he had been serving in Korea. He was deployed there. He was actually coming back to the United States when he made this side trip to Vladivostok, Russia. And we're told, according to officials here, that he was there to visit a woman he may have been romantically linked to. Now, at some point during this trip, which, by the way, was not approved by his superiors, he did not get clearance or approval to travel to Russia. At some point on Thursday, he was detained by Russian authorities. They're saying he was involved in some criminal misconduct. Officials say it had something to do with stealing from this woman who he went there to visit, Hallie. At this point, he's in pretrial confinement, but that's about all we know. The State Department is saying that they are actively seeking to get consular access to him now, Hallie.
Okay, and I might be 6 steps too far now, right? In the process of okay, well, what happens? How do you get this person out of detention in Russia? Because I think everybody thinks of detention in Russia and probably thinks of Evan Gershkovich, of course, that detained Wall Street Journal reporter. Obviously a different situation for a couple of reasons. Number one, the U.S. has made the assessment that Gershkovich has been wrongfully detained. There's Paul Whelan, of course, who's detained in Russia, too. Civilians. Do things change when it's an active military person?
Yeah, yes, it has to, right? Now, that being said, we don't know we don't know in what direction it's going to change. And the reality is every single one of these cases, as we've seen, has been its individual case and hasn't played out in the same way as others. You know, so that's a great question. I think what we're waiting for now is to see, you know, where exactly is he being held and in what conditions? State Department still has not been able to talk to him. They've notified his family that he's been detained, but that's about it. You know, they're still trying to get some kind of access to him. At this point, officials are concerned that he will be held in pretrial confinement for a number of weeks before they even have an opportunity to speak to him.
Courtney Cube live for us there at the Pentagon Court. Thank you very much for watching all of that for us tonight. Appreciate it. Coming up, much more to get to here on the show. Officials say at least 2 people are dead after a building collapse in South Africa. What crews are doing to try to get to dozens of others. Plus, the Chinese president making his first trip to Europe in years today. Why he wants to team up with France's leader. Next. Tonight, a man's behind bars after pulling a gun on a pastor who was in the middle of a sermon. A dramatic and terrifying scene, all caught on camera. Look at this.
And God has chose.
You see that moment, the pastor finds himself staring down the barrel of the gun. That's a deacon who comes running up, tackles the man, gets kind of the situation under control. Let me play more.
Out of nowhere, all I seen was he just like turned and like pulled out a gun, and you didn't see it was concealed all the way until it was in my face.
A stunning and terrifying moment for him. Emily Aketa has been following this one, and the pastor says he'd never actually seen this guy before. Tell us more.
Yeah, so police are identifying the suspect that you saw in that video as 26-year-old Bernard Polite, and we know from police that he lived within a mile of the church. But interestingly, both Polite and the pastor say they never knew each other. They didn't know each other. So much so, in fact, that the pastor told me that as the suspect had been walking towards the pulpit, he thought that maybe he was just a visitor going to see his brother, who, by the way, is also a pastor, until he essentially was staring down the barrel of the gun. Fortunately, the gun had jammed. You can actually even hear it jamming in the video, giving the chance for some churchgoers to help take him down and wrangle the gun away. I want you to listen to a piece of our emotional interview with Pastor Glenn Germany on what he said about his conversation with the suspect after this all panned out. Take a listen.
He apologized, and he don't know why he did it. He said that there was just spirits in his mind talking to him, telling him, go in and kill the pastor. And he said, when those spirits is in your mind, you do what the spirits tell you to do.
And the developments, we heard of more alarming developments throughout the day from investigators. Hours later, hours after that church incident panned out, family of the suspect had gone to his home and discovered a cousin, Derek Polite, had been shot and killed at that house. There's an investigation that is now underway. I should point out, though, investigators are not making the link. They are not saying whether or not they believe the suspect of the church incident is involved. As of right now, Polite is facing aggravated assault, attempted homicide, and reckless endangerment. Family tells me that he has a history of mental illness, though they have not seen any kind of alarming behavior in recent weeks in the Pittsburgh area, and they are shocked by Sunday's violence. Hallie.
Emily Aketa, thank you very much for that. To politics now, and here's a sentence I don't know that anybody on this particular Earth timeline ever thought we might say. The White House is out tonight with a pretty strong clapback against the governor of South Dakota, suggesting she should stop digging herself into a hole after Kristi Noem suggested President Biden should also consider shooting his dog, Commander, like Noem did with her own puppy, Cricket. Listen.
This is a country that loves dogs, and you have a leader talking about putting dogs down, killing them, and that's a disturbing statement to say. I would say to her is she probably should stop digging herself in a hole.
That is the latest fallout for Noem after this bizarro news cycle driven by the now infamous anecdote that appears in her new book, out tomorrow, in which she describes executing her 14-month-old puppy because of what she describes as problematic behavior. Listen to what she said in an interview this weekend when she was pressed about that.
Biden's dog has attacked 24 Secret Service
people. So how many people is enough people to be attacked and dangerously hurt before you make a decision on a dog and what to do with it?
Well, he's not living at the White House
That's
anymore.
the question that the president should be held accountable to.
Remember, President Biden's dog commander was moved from the White House last year after a series of biting incidents. Dasha Burns is joining us now. So now we're in like the dog timeline, right? This actual discussion here for somebody who was at one point considered a possible vice presidential contender after she described in detail in this book shooting and killing this puppy. She says that it was an issue with safety, concerned that the dog, I believe, was going after some chickens, tried to bite, I think, an individual or two. Where does this even go? And do we have any reporting on the reaction from inside Trump world, considering she was, again, at one point, perhaps on that semi-short list for VP?
Well, she is continuing to keep it going, Hallie. We just learned from her social media that she's going to be doing another network interview tonight. No doubt we'll be asked about this again. But over the weekend, when Palm Beach really kind of became the epicenter of Republican politics here, Noam did attend part of a major donor retreat for Republicans here. The former president did actually give her a bit of a shout out during his 90-minute speech about a room of about 400 donors. He said, you know, she's been a supporter of mine for a long time. I've been a supporter of hers. Notably, though, he did not bring her up on stage when he called a bunch of the top VP contenders and other stars in the Republican Party up on stage with him at Mar-a-Lago. We're told by some sources that she left a little bit before the formal program began. But yeah, I mean, this is, from the sources that I've been talking to, very much a knock on her chances at becoming Trump's running mate. He did shout out a bunch of other names, including of course, as we know, Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, Senators J.D. Vance, Tim Scott, Marco Rubio, Representative Byron Donalds, all getting a lot of different kinds of praise. Noam is in a tricky spot right now, Hallie.
Dasha Burns, live first there in West Palm. Dasha, thank you. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, I-95 in Connecticut is now back open and good to go. You see the cars passing through there after a fuel truck collided with 2 other cars and burst into flames a few days ago. Look at that. Crews also had to tear down a bridge because of heat damage from the crash. Number 2, Planters nuts getting recalled today because of a potential listeria contamination that affects some of the mixed nuts and honey roasted peanuts. Listeria is pretty dangerous. There's no reports of anybody getting sick, fortunately, but the manufacturer says they're doing this out of an abundance of caution. Number 3, Equinox is now launching a new gym membership, $40,000 to try to help people live longer. It's called Optimize by Equinox. It includes everything from personal training to nutrition plans to sleep coaching to massage therapy. The company says, I want to quote this here, it is a human-first, highly luxury service meets data meets coaching program. You'll be able to find it by the end of the month in New York City and a town in Texas. Number 4, I want to show you something. What you're watching, what you see right now, is totally made by AI, with this indie artist releasing the first ever entirely AI-generated music video created by Sora from OpenAI. Remember, Sora can make videos based on ideas you type into it. The director says the technology lets you explore and discover new things you might never have dreamed of. OpenAI has not responded to our request for comment. Number 5, got to give you a live look at fashion's biggest night. Yes, it is the Met Gala red carpet. I don't control the live shot camera, folks. I hate to tell you. That's a bust, not a dress, but presumably we'll get some good gown shots pretty soon. The theme is Sleeping Beauty's reawakening fashion. And the dress code is called Garden of Time. You're seeing some of the earlier arrivals now. It's always so interesting to see how folks interpret this. Garden taken literally, florals. Some of the co-chairs include Bad Bunny, Jennifer Lopez, etc. When we come back, the protests may be trying to interrupt the Met Gala we just showed you. We're going to take you there live. Plus, why more than 1 million people turned out to see Madonna in Brazil. So as we've been on the air, we just showed you the live red carpet at the Met Gala. Turns out, not too far away, there are a number of protesters, pro-Palestinian demonstrators heading there. Stephen Romo is walking with them. Stephen, I believe you're coming from Hunter College. You're joining us now, basically off your phone. Talk us through it. What are you seeing? What's the vibe?
Yeah, Hallie, on my phone, certainly because it was much easier to keep up with these protesters. They've actually been trying to make their way through the Met to speak to the celebrities and everyone that's going to show up and share the cause that they obviously feel very strongly about. But they keep encountering the NYPD, which has set up many blockades up to 8 to 10 blocks around the Met Gala right now, preventing these protesters from making their way up. We followed them from Hunter College, which is several blocks south of here. They made their way up, encountered these blocks, and instead chose to go through Central Park to try to get their way around, eventually finding this way through, probably about the closest that they're going to be able to get. We are, I think, 2 to 3 blocks away from the Met right now. We just heard the NYPD telling the protesters that they have to leave the roadway. They've been blocking several streets as they've continued marching, trying to make their way there. And they are talking about exactly what they've been talking about. Before the camps were cleared, before the big event we saw at Columbia administration building being cleared last week, they are asking that these institutions divest. And now they are really talking about the ceasefire, which they say should have gone into effect today, which actually did not end up happening. Feeling very passionate about that. And they've actually made it across the street. So we have a little bit of keeping up to do to see where they end up next.
All right, I'm going to let you go catch up with them, Stephen Romo. Obviously, with these protests, looking ahead to commencements. Tonight, it is all about the Met Gala. That's why we were showing that split screen there as the protesters maybe try to get their way a little closer. I'm going to let you go catch up with them, catch up with your crew. Stephen, thank you so much. NBC News covers hundreds of international stories every day, and because it can be tough to read or watch or listen to them all, our teams around the world have done it for you. Here's a look at what they're watching in a segment we call The Global. Out of South Africa today, at least 2 workers are dead after an apartment building collapsed. It was under construction. Apparently, dozens of others are trapped. You can see there that cloud of dust. That's the building falling. Officials say about 20 people have already been pulled out of the rubble, 20 workers. They are now in the hospital. Out of France, the Chinese president in Paris to meet with the French leader to talk about things like trade. It is Xi Jinping's first trip to Europe in 5 years and comes at a time when tensions are pretty high. French President Emmanuel Macron asked Xi to make trade with Europe more balanced and to pressure Russia to end the war in Ukraine. Xi says they should team up to prevent a new Cold War. And out of Brazil, Madonna just putting on her biggest concert ever. Something like 1.6 million people reportedly coming out for the concert in Rio, which was free. Some fans waited for days to get a good spot. This is the last show of Madonna's Celebration World Tour. You can see all those folks packed in to watch her. Coming up, we are just hours away from a very high-stakes moment for Boeing. How the company's getting ready for something it's never done before. The FAA late today rolling out a new investigation into Boeing after the company acknowledged some of its employees skipped certain safety inspections on its 787 Dreamliner planes. That news dropping just hours before a moment that Boeing hopes will be a reason to celebrate. That's because later tonight, the company is going to try to launch 2 astronauts to the International Space Station on its Starliner spacecraft. And listen, Boeing wants this to work. Right? They need this to work. Obviously, not just from a safety perspective. There are lives on the line here, but perhaps for perception reasons, too, at a time when the company's reputation has taken a bunch of hits, going back to those deadly crashes on the 737 MAX plane several years ago. This year, there was that blown-out door plug incident on the Alaska Airlines flight. In March, the company's CEO says he'll step down as Boeing's trying to navigate Senate hearings, investigations, et cetera, including the one we just learned about today. NBC's Tom Costello is joining us from Florida's Kennedy Space Center. I definitely want to get to the Starliner launch in a second because that's a huge deal for Boeing. It's a big deal for space travel generally. Yeah. But let me just quickly start with this FAA investigation we've just learned about. What should we know?
Bottom line here is that the FAA says Boeing came forward. An employee saw something and said something. And that employee said, I think employees may have signed off on paperwork pledging that, in fact, inspections had occurred when they hadn't occurred. Specifically, looking at whether the wings were properly attached to the fuselage, the bonding, as well as the wiring. That's a serious problem. If they've signed paperwork saying inspections were done and they weren't done, that is falsification of airline records. That immediately involves an FAA investigation, could also involve a criminal investigation. So the FAA says it is now looking at this. Boeing says it came forward, it raised the flag and self-reported. And at the same time now, Boeing's got an even bigger problem with another plane. Now they've got to try to inspect every 787 still on the production line and then decide what they do about planes that are flying already. Boeing says it has no reason to believe that this is a safety of flight issue, but this is, yet again, Boeing in the spotlight for quality control.
Well, and so that is the backdrop to this moment, the reason why you're down south for us right now with this live shot here. Boeing really wants a win here, and this Starliner thing could be it for Boeing. How are folks there feeling about it? Are they nervous? Are they excited? All of the above?
Yeah, all of the above, absolutely. But let's not forget, 2 lives are on the line here.
That's right.
2 veteran astronauts, Sunita Williams and Butch Wilmore. They are veteran NASA astronauts. They are veteran Navy test pilots. They will climb into the Starliner tonight for a 10:30 p.m. liftoff, and all systems are go right now. But to your point about the troubled history here, it was back in 2019. I was here. We had the first uncrewed test flight for Starliner. It lifted off, and then they had a major malfunction. They had to abort. They found out that software errors had allowed the computers inside the spaceship to be off by 11 hours. The clocks were off by 11 hours. Fast forward, they had another problem. They realized that, in fact, they weren't ready to fly in 2022. And then they also discovered in 2023, last June, that they had flammable tape inside the spaceship. Flammable, remember Apollo 1, where the astronauts burned to death? And they had parachute straps that might not be strong enough. So they delayed again until today. Now they say they're convinced the spaceship is ready to go, and it's going to go up at 10:34 p.m. Eastern time. And everybody here is watching. Everybody wants this to go off well.
You know who else is probably watching? Their competitors over at SpaceX. Fair?
100%. I mean, listen, who would have thought? If you would have asked me 5 years ago, who's going to be the first to get to the space station, Boeing or SpaceX, that young upstart, the whippersnappers? I would have said, oh, Boeing, by far, right? They were behind Apollo. And they have still not gotten a crew to the space station, while SpaceX has flown 11 crewed missions to the space station. So Boeing has lost a ton of money. It's over budget. It's overdue. And the pressure is on. They've got to deliver. They've got to deliver tonight. But most importantly, they've got to make sure that these astronauts' lives are protected, that they get there and get home safely.
Tom Costello at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. We should note that NBC News Now will have that live coverage tonight, right ahead of that launch at 10:30 Eastern time. Tom, we'll be talking again, I am sure. Thank you so much, friend. Appreciate it. Lots more still to come on the show, including the former leader of Starbucks saying that the experience at the stores these days kind of stinks. They need to get back on their coffee grind. We'll explain what the company's doing about it now. New fallout tonight from what experts say is a pretty extraordinary open letter from the former head of Starbucks, blasting his old company, basically saying they've got to get back to basics like good coffee and good service. Howard Schultz now saying stores have to have, I'm quoting here, a maniacal focus on the customer experience. Another ding at Starbucks, which is getting hammered by investors. Look at its stock price, down something like 30% since last May. Brian Chung is joining us now, one of the most iconic brands in the world. You can go anywhere and find a Starbucks, right? They're huge. But Howard Schultz is basically saying, okay, instead of like spicy lemonade, focus more on like eliminating long lines. You've even got Jim Cramer, who folks over, know it, our friends at CNBC. He's saying today he's never seen anything like what Schultz is doing. Why now?
Yeah, and he had an interview with his CEO, our colleagues over at CNBC, basically asking him and pressing him on the earnings results, which was really the nexus for this entire conversation. Starbucks, the company, reporting last week that their revenue and also their bottom line earnings were well below what Wall Street economists or what Wall Street analysts had been expecting. Moreover, they also had guidance, which is basically the projection for how much money they're going to make in the future, that were slashed compared to the last time they offered projections about 3 months ago. And one big story behind all this appears to be that customers that only go to Starbucks on a casual basis are simply not going there anymore. If you're a loyal customer who goes day after day after day, you're probably still going, but it's the casual consumers, which they rely on so much for the remainder of the revenue, that don't appear to be coming into the store as much. How do they get that back up? They're saying it's going to be based off of the app. They're going to try to push more promos. We'll see if that works.
Do you see any degree of like CEO corner office drama here? Like, is that what Schultz might be planning?
Yeah, well, we have to remember that Howard Schultz has had instances in his career where he has left Starbucks and then come back. He left the position as CEO in 2000, stayed within the company, but then came back during the financial crisis in 2008, and then he left again later on. He then returned briefly in 2022 on an interim basis while they were trying to find a successor, which they found a few months after that. So Howard Schultz has been kind of the North Star for this company, and him kind of posting on LinkedIn suggests that he's very much dialed into this company still. Could that be something where the board says, all right, Howard's got some thoughts, maybe we should give him a ring and bring him back again? That's very much part of the speculation today, although, of course, it remains to be seen.
What are people so annoyed about with Starbucks? Like, is it the long lines? Is it that it's getting expensive? Like, what is the issue for customers?
Yeah, well, I mean, it does appear to be, on one hand, a function of the inflation environment that we're in. I mean, not many people want to go to Starbucks, get a cold brew with sweet cream foam on top, and then end up $7 deep in the hole when they walk out. But they are a premium product, right? They're supposed to be more expensive than Dunkin' Donuts. So you look at food spending, people are spending, but are they choosing to get more bang for the buck by maybe getting a coffee and a donut somewhere else? Maybe.
Brian Chong, thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. That does it for us for this hour. We've got more coverage picking up right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.